Welcome everyone we've got a very large crowd today, and we'll get started here in a few minutes. We just have, which is typical for this webinar series, just to go over a few logistics and upcoming events that we have that you might be interested in. Before we start our lead and copper webinar, which is the first one for 2021 in this series. As Galen said, you can ask questions at any time in your chat navigation bar. There's a questions box and a chat box, so feel free to ask questions at any time. You'll also be able to, and Tom will go over that, we'll have a Q&A session, and you'll be able to type in questions throughout the presentation today for the Q&A session, which will be held from 3:30 to 4 today. This is a special, in case you didn't notice, a 2-hour webinar today because we have a lot of information to present to you. And also webinar support, you can contact Cadmus Group here at the email you see on this title slide. Okay, next slide, please. For those of you who are interested in certificates, we do give out certificates of attendance for this webinar. You must attend. I know it says 60 minutes. We are going to actually give a few more credits this time because this is a 2-hour webinar. I'm not sure, did the slides disappear, or is that just, are we still good?
It should be showing now.
Okay, thank you. And so if you attend for at least 60 minutes, you'll get an hour. You can get up to an hour and a half of credit for attending this webinar. If there are people in the room with you, there is a form here. You can click on this slide, or you can also click in your navigation bar. It was posted to provide the names of additional people in the room with you if they'd also like a certificate. Next slide, please. And just a reminder on those certificates, that's for the live webinar. We do post the recordings within 2 weeks of this webinar on the webinar webpage, but you can only receive a certificate for attending the live broadcast. Just a couple upcoming webinars you might be interested in. We have a water reuse webinar tomorrow as part of our water research webinar series you can register for. And the next small systems webinar coming up in March is on disinfection byproducts. That registration will be available soon, so look for that for March 30th. And next slide. And I just wanted to let everyone know that, as many of you may know, we hold an annual drinking water workshop in partnership with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. This workshop is scheduled. It's for August 30th through September 2nd, and it will be virtual again this year. And we don't have registration open, but you can go to the website and receive notification when registration will be available. And we also have a call for abstracts out right now. So if you are interested in presenting during one of our technical sessions, please visit our website and feel free to submit an abstract through April 20th. And before I turn it over to Tom to introduce the speakers and the talks coming up, I do want to remind everyone that we are all working virtually here, broadcasting from our homes. So please, we're doing our best to reduce background noise, but if you hear a doorbell or maybe a dog barking or something, forgive us for that, as we're all teleworking. With that, Tom, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the speakers.
Great, Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so today, as Michelle mentioned, we have an extra half an hour. So we have 3 presentations today, 4 speakers, plus some people that can come and help with questions. So we've got a full plate. So please stay with us for the extra half an hour. Our first talk will be given by Anne Lausier. Anne's a physical scientist with the Office of Groundwater Drinking Water with the Standards and Risk Management Division. Currently, her work focuses on the review and revision of the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, including the lead and copper rule revisions and the 6-year review of the drinking water standards. Anne has an MS and Ph.D. in civil engineering from the University of Maine. The second speaker in the first presentation is Iliriana Mushkolaj. Iliriana, excuse me, is also with the Standards and Risk Management Division. She's working on the lead and copper rule revisions, 6-year review of the drinking water standards, and the contaminant candidate list. She has managed the federalism consultations and wrote small system flexibility provisions and source water monitoring provisions for the lead and copper rule revisions. Iliriana has a MS and a Ph.D. From George Mason University. And with that, I would also like to introduce Lisa Christ. Lisa is the chief of the Targeting and Analysis branch of the Standards and Risk Management Division, and she will be giving a brief introduction to our first presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll put my camera on too. Okay, so next slide. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. We're excited to talk about the lead and copper rule revisions, but I did want to make sure that everyone was aware that EPA does intend to follow the science and law in accordance with the new Biden administration's executive orders and Safe Drinking Water Act. There are a couple of new White House memorandum and executive orders that will impact the lead and copper rule revisions. One is related to a regulatory freeze and review memorandum, and the other is related to Executive Order 1390, which directs the EPA to go back and review previously promulgated regulations that were published in the last 4 years. So the lead and copper rule revisions will be subject to both of these actions. At this time, the agency has not made any decision on how to implement the memorandum and executive order, but I did want to make sure people were aware that the lead and copper rule will be impacted by these executive orders, and we're awaiting decisions. With that, I'm going to ask Anne to go ahead and begin the presentation of the rule that we published on January 15th. So, Anne, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to start by providing highlights of the revised rule. The revised lead and copper rule strengthens every aspect of the current rule to better protect children and communities from the risks of lead exposure. There are 3 major goals of the revised lead and copper rule. The first is to better protect children at schools and childcare facilities, including a new requirement for lead testing in those facilities. The second is to get the lead out of our nation's drinking water, including through improvements to lead service line replacement. And the third is to empower communities through information so that consumers can take steps to reduce their lead exposure. Next slide, please. Now, before moving into the specifics of the revised rule, I'm going to go over some background information. The lead and copper rule was first promulgated in 1991 and was revised in 2000 and again in 2007. It applies to approximately 68,000 community and non-transient, non-community public water systems supplying water to over 300 million people. The lead and copper rule is a treatment technique regulation rather than an MCL, and it requires water systems to take actions to reduce exposure to the extent feasible. EPA works with primacy agencies on an ongoing basis in order to ensure proper implementation of the rule. Next slide, please. Now, lead is generally not found naturally in water, but it can enter drinking water through the corrosion of lead-containing plumbing materials and infrastructure. In order to prevent lead from entering our drinking water, the lead and copper rule requires some systems to treat water with chemicals to reduce corrosion. When corrosion control treatment is not enough to reduce lead exposure, systems are required to educate the public about lead risks in drinking water and to replace lead service lines. Next slide, please. So as part of the lead and copper rule revision process, EPA conducted extensive consultations with stakeholders and the public. The proposal was published in November of 2019, and we received about 80,000 public comments. The final lead and copper rule revision identifies the most at-risk communities and ensures that water systems are prepared to rapidly respond by taking actions to reduce elevated lead levels in drinking water. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the specific requirements of the revised rule and how they compare with the current rule or soon to be previous rule. Next slide. So some important terminology to go over. The maximum contaminant level goal is a health-based value and is set where there are no known health effects within an adequate margin of safety. In the current rule, the MCLG is set at 0 because there is no safe level of lead. For copper, the MCLG is set at 1.3 milligrams per liter. As I mentioned previously, in 1991, the lead and copper rule established a treatment technique rule, which includes public education, corrosion control treatment, and lead service line replacement if a system exceeds the action level for lead or copper. The action level is based on the 90th percentile of tap sampling results, and for lead, this is set at 15 micrograms per liter and copper at 1.3 milligrams per liter. It is important to note that exceeding the action level is not a violation in and of itself, but not taking one of the required actions is. Next slide, please. So the revised rule establishes a new trigger level, which allows for meaningful reduction in lead exposure by requiring systems to take a progressive set of actions to reduce lead at the tap. The trigger level is set at 10 micrograms per liter, and this is in addition to the action level and not a replacement. For water systems that exceed the trigger level, but not the action level, there are some new requirements. They must sample annually and are not eligible for reduced tap sampling. They must implement a goal-based lead service line replacement program and conduct public education outreach to customers with lead service lines. Systems must also conduct a corrosion control treatment study if they do not already have CCT installed, and they must re-optimize their CCT if they do have it installed. And I'm going to go over some of these actions in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So currently, all community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems must collect first liter tap samples at homes and buildings that are at the highest risk for lead and copper contamination. Next slide. The number of samples required varies by the size of the population served by the system, and this can range from 100 samples to 5. The rule requires 6-month monitoring, but systems can reduce the number of required samples and sample frequency by meeting certain criteria. Systems are also required to perform a materials evaluation so that they could identify the sampling sites. Next slide, please. Under the revised rule, the tap sample site criteria has been revised to place a greater emphasis on lead service line sites. The new tiering criteria also places copper pipes with lead solder in a lower tier regardless of their age. There are also some changes to how samples are used to calculate the 90th percentile. For systems with lead service lines, 100% of the tap samples must come from lead service line sites, and all samples must be used to calculate the 90th percentile for lead, even if more than the minimum number of required samples are collected. So to give you an example, if a system is required to sample at 100 sites and they collect 110 samples from lead service line sites, they will use all of those results to calculate their 90th percentile lead level. Now, if a system does not have enough lead service line sites to sample at, they must collect samples from both lead service line and non-lead service line sites. However, they must use the highest non-lead service line tap samples if more than the minimum number are collected. So going back to our example, if you have a system that's required to sample at 100 sites and they collect 90 samples from lead service line sites and 20 from non-lead service line sites, they must use all of the lead service line samples, but only the highest 10 results from the non-lead service line sites in the calculation for a total of 100 samples. Water systems that do not have any lead service lines will use all of their samples that they collect to calculate the 90th percentile, even if they've collected more than the minimum number of required samples. Next slide, please. There's also been a change in the tap sample collection protocol. So for all lead service line sites, the 5th liter must now be collected and analyzed for lead. This 5th liter is representative of the water that's been in contact with the lead service line. If the water system is also collecting copper at the same time, they must retain the 1st liter sample for copper analysis. The revised rule also prohibits systems from including instructions to remove and clean aerators prior to doing sampling or any pre-stagnation flushing, which might depress lead levels. Systems must also provide wide-mouth bottles for tap sample collection, which allows for flow rates that are more characteristic of flow when filling a glass of water. Collectively, these sampling requirements will better identify elevated lead levels and result in more water systems taking required lead mitigation actions. In terms of the monitoring frequency, systems will now need to have lower lead levels longer in order to go to reduced monitoring. Systems that are above the trigger level but below the action level must monitor at least annually and are not eligible for triennial monitoring. Systems above the action level must monitor every 6 months and must have results at or below the action level for 2 years or 4 monitoring periods in order to move to annual monitoring. Also, systems with new sources or a long-term treatment change must do 6-month monitoring until they have the results at or below the action level for 2 consecutive monitoring periods. Next slide, please. There are also changes to the corrosion control treatment requirements. When the lead and copper rule was first promulgated, systems serving more than 50,000 people were required to begin optimized corrosion control treatment. This occurred in the 1994 to 1998 period. Systems serving fewer than 50,000 people were required to begin OCCT if they had an action level exceedance. So when a system exceeds the action level, the system makes a corrosion control treatment recommendation to the state, and then the state approves or designates an alternative. Once CCT is installed, the water system must conduct follow-up monitoring for 1 year. Next slide, please. Using that monitoring data, the state designates optimal water quality parameters, and the system must maintain those OWQPs. So as I mentioned earlier, exceeding the action level is not a violation, but failure to maintain the optimized water quality parameters is. One important thing to note here is that small and medium systems under the current rule can discontinue the OCCT steps if they meet the action level in 2 consecutive monitoring periods. So one thing we were seeing is that systems would be in this cycle of starting and stopping the OCCT steps and might not actually ever install corrosion control treatment. Next slide, please. Under the revised rule, water systems with OCCT are required to re-optimize if the 90th percentile exceeds either the trigger level or the action level. Systems without OCCT must conduct a study if they exceed the trigger level and then implement it if the action level is exceeded. So this means that systems will be prepared and able to install CCT faster than under the current rule. The rule also revised the sanitary survey requirements to include CCT and OWQP assessment. Next slide, please. So as part of the study, the revised rule requires that systems evaluate orthophosphate-based inhibitors. The rule also establishes some additional specifications for systems to study alternative CCTs. It also requires systems to conduct a find and fix for any individual tap samples that exceed 15 micrograms per liter. Next slide, please. Find and fix is a new requirement to address individual tap sites that have elevated lead samples, even if a system does not have a trigger level or lead action level exceedance. If it requires that a system collect follow-up samples for each lead tap sample site that exceeds 15 micrograms per liter within 30 days of the system receiving the results to identify the potential source of lead. Systems may use any sampling protocol or technique to collect the follow-up samples. So if the sample came from a lead service line site, that doesn't mean that the system has to collect a 5th liter sample. They could take a 1st liter sample or 250 mil or use different stagnation time, whatever is most appropriate to identify that source of lead. And as such, these follow-up samples are not included in the 90th percentile calculation, but they do need to be submitted to the state. Next slide, please. If a system does have CCT installed, they must collect a water quality parameter sample within 5 days of receiving results at a site that is close to the tap sample site as possible. Could you go back 1 slide, please? Thank you. This is to assess water quality as close to the time the initial sample was taken as possible. Systems then must determine if some sort of a fix is needed, and this could be something like a localized adjustment to CCT, conducting flushing, or another type of localized distribution system maintenance. And I should note that EPA does not anticipate that systems will make large-scale CCT changes resulting from find and fix. Systems are also not responsible for fixing things that are deemed outside of their control, such as a premise plumbing issue. But they must document this to the state. I will now turn it over to my colleague Iliriana to talk about the remaining provisions of the rule.
Thank you, Anne. I will start with the lead service line replacement. Current rule requires systems that fail to meet the lead action level after installing corrosion control to replace 7% of lead service lines per year. They are only required to replace their portion of the service line, They are only required to replace their portion of the service line, so the partial lead service line replacements are allowed to count towards the mandatory replacement rate. Water systems are also allowed to test out, which means that if they take a water sample from a lead service line and it tests at or below 15 parts per billion, then that would still count as a lead service line replacement. If the system does not own the entire lead service line, they must notify the owner that they are replacing their portion of the service line and offer to replace the owner's portion of the line at owner's cost. Lead service line replacement continues until the system meets the lead action level for 2 consecutive monitoring periods. If the system exceeds the lead action level after that, they must restart replacing lead service lines. Next slide, please. The new rule starts with a lead service line inventory. Water systems must complete a lead service line inventory by the compliance date of January 16, 2024. This is important as the location of lead service line is critical to tap sample site selection, and tap sampling protocol. The inventory must identify materials of service line within the distribution system and classify them according to this categorization. Lead service lines, lead status unknown or just unknown, where the service line material is not verified by the compliance date. It's okay to have unknowns in the initial inventory with improvements in updates. Then galvanized lines requiring replacements and non-lead service lines. The inventory must be made publicly available. Lead connectors, such as goosenecks or pigtails, are not required to be included in the inventory. However, EPA does recommend including them where records exist. Another component of the new rule is that the water system must replace lead connectors when encountered. The inventory must include a location identifier associated with each lead service line or galvanized line requiring replacement. The inventory must be updated annually or triannually if the system is on reduced monitoring. Next slide, please. A new component of the revised rule is the lead service line replacement plan, which must be submitted by the compliance date along with the inventory. According to this provision, all water systems with 1 or more lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or unknown service lines in their distribution system must prepare a sufficiently detailed lead service line replacement plan by the compliance date. The plan must include the following 7 elements: a strategy for determining the composition of lead status unknown lines, a procedure for conducting a full replacement, a strategy for informing customers before a replacement takes place. For systems serving more than 10,000 people, the plan must recommend the replacement goal rate in the event of lead trigger level exceedance, which I will discuss in a minute. A procedure for customers to flush the lines following a disturbance or a replacement of the service line. A lead service line replacement prioritization strategy that at a minimum includes disadvantaged consumers, populations most sensitive to the effects of lead, and targeting known lead service lines. And the plan must include a funding strategy to accommodate customers unable to pay. Having a plan in place not only helps water systems to be ready on the compliance date, but also in general helps them meet their goals, and also they are prepared when customers notify them of the intent to replace their portion of the service line. Next slide, please. When a customer notifies the water system of replacement of the customer's portion of the service line, the water system must replace its portion of the lead service line as well. This is to prevent partial lead service line replacements from occurring. Water systems that serve more than 10,000 persons that exceed the trigger level but are at or below the action level must conduct goal-based full lead service line replacement at a rate approved by the state, irrespective of the corrosion control treatment status. Water systems serving 10,000 people or fewer that exceed the lead trigger level, but not the action level, may choose the small system flexibility, which I will discuss shortly. Next slide, please. In terms of mandatory lead service line replacements, water systems serving more than 10,000 persons that exceed the lead action level must fully replace annually 3% of lead service lines based on a rolling 2-year average. In these cases, they must conduct replacements regardless of the status of the corrosion control treatment. They can stop the 3% annual lead service line replacements when system is below the action level for 2 years, and if the system has replaced an overall average of 3% of lead service lines per year. All lead service line replacements must be full replacements, except in limited situations such as emergency repair or unwilling or unable customer when conducting infrastructure replacements. However, partial lead service lines do not count towards the annual 3% requirement. The revised lead and copper rule removes the test out provision, which I described earlier, which means that even if all samples from a lead service line are at or below the action level, it is not considered replaced. For mitigation purposes, service line replacement, after a service line replacement, the revised rule requires public water systems to distribute filters and replacement cartridges for 6 months. Next slide, please. As presented here in this comparison table, the revised lead and copper rule will result in overall more lead service line replacements than the previous rule. The new rule requires 3% replacements. However, it must start regardless of the CCT status. The replacements must be full replacements, and it must continue for at least 3 years, which is for monitoring periods. The lead service line replacement rate of the new rule applies to a wider universe of service lines, which includes lead service lines, galvanized requiring replacements, and unknowns that could potentially be lead service lines. Also, in the new rule, the replacement program starts sooner at the exceedance of the trigger level, as opposed to the old rule, where it starts at the action level exceedance. Next slide, please. Small system flexibility. So in the previous slides, I discussed requirements for systems serving more than 10,000 people. The new rule provides systems serving 10,000 or fewer persons and all non-transient, non-community water systems greater flexibility to comply with the requirements of the rule. Under the new rule, if these systems exceed the trigger level but do not exceed the action level, they must evaluate and recommend to the state one of the 4 compliance alternatives. The compliance alternatives, which must be approved by the state, include full lead service line replacement. It should be noted that all lead service lines replacements must be all lead service lines must be replaced within 15 years, and once the implementation of this option starts, the replacement cannot stop even if water lead levels drop. The second option is installation and maintenance of optimized corrosion control treatment. Then it's installation and maintenance of point-of-use devices and replacement of all lead-bearing plumbing fixtures at every tap where water could be used for human consumption. This applies to systems that have replaced all of their service lines, but the lead levels are still high. In the event a water system subsequently exceeds the lead action level, it must implement the approved option. Next slide, please. For notifications and public education, the current rule requires that water systems must provide an annual CCR that includes lead sampling results, as well as an informational statement about the health effects of lead exposure and actions the customers can take that can reduce this exposure. If a water system has a violation of the treatment technique, the systems must send a public notification to all consumers within 30 days. And for failure to monitor or report results, they must send a notice within 1 year. Next slide, please. Still staying on the previous rule, water systems that exceed the lead action level must begin a public education program. The purpose of public education is to inform consumers of the elevated levels of lead, provide information about sources of lead in drinking water and the health effects of lead, and the actions consumers can take to reduce exposure. Under the current rule, water systems are required to provide consumers with their tap sample results within 30 days of sample collection. Next slide, please. Moving on to the requirements of the revised rule for notification and public education. The revised lead and copper rule provides more information to the public, such as it requires that water systems let the public know the general location of lead service lines by making the lead service line inventory publicly available. And for large systems that serve over 50,000 people, the inventory must be available online. Water systems must notify consumers within 24 hours of an action level exceedance. This is pursuant to the WIN Act. They are required to provide notice to customers within 3 days if their individual tap sample exceeds the 15 parts per billion. The new rule requires water systems with lead service lines that exceed the trigger level to reach out to customers with lead service lines annually and inform them of their replacement program. The new rule requires that public education must be delivered to impacted consumers during water-related work that may disturb the lead service line, such as main replacement, meter changes, etc. The rule specifies that the CCR health effects language must be updated to be more concise and less redundant, must specify the availability of the lead service lines inventory and report the range of tap sample levels, and also provide public access to tap sample results. Next slide, please. Sampling and education at schools and childcare facilities. This is a new requirement in the lead and copper rule revisions and requires sampling in schools and licensed childcare facilities. This provision requires community water systems to develop a list of customers or service connections that provide water to schools or licensed childcare providers. They must verify this list every 5 years. During the first 5 years after the compliance date, water systems are required to sample for lead in 20% of the elementary schools and 20% of the childcare facilities they serve each year. For each childcare facility, they must collect 2 samples, and for each school, they must collect 5 samples. Community water systems are required to sample for lead in the secondary schools they serve on request. After the first 5 years, water systems are required to sample all schools and childcare facilities on request. Next slide, please. The water systems are required to provide the EPA's 3Ts toolkit for reducing lead in drinking water in schools and childcare facilities. They must provide sampling results to the sampled facility, primacy agency, and state and local health department, and also annually certify to the primacy agency that it met the notification and sampling requirements. Next slide, please. Now I will briefly list the next steps. Next slide, please. As you are aware, the LCRR was published in the Federal Register on January 15, 2021. Currently, the LCRR effective date is March 16, 2021. However, as Lisa mentioned in the introduction, we will follow the recent executive orders. Water systems must comply with previous LCR as codified in the July 1st, 2020 CFR until the lead and copper rule revisions compliance date. Lead service line inventory and lead service line replacement plan are due on the compliance date. EPA will work with state and interested stakeholders to provide guidance and other tools. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne and Iliriana. Thank you for those wonderful presentations. We will be handling all questions. We have billions and billions of questions from our first presentation. But we have 2 more presentations to go. So if you still have questions and you have questions on the next 2 talks, still put them into the question box in the dialog box that can pop down, and we'll try to get to everything. We probably won't be able to, but and we'll try to combine some questions, but feel free, keep sending in these great questions. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Simoni Triantafyllidou. Simoni is an environmental engineer with the Office of Research and Development in the Center for Environmental Solutions and Emergency Response. She conducts research on metal corrosion and inorganic contamination of drinking water, spanning the fields of aquatic chemistry, corrosion science, drinking water quality and treatment, sustainable drinking water infrastructure, and public health. Simoni holds a MS and a PhD from Virginia Tech. And with that, I will pass it off to Simoni for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Tom. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. Please give me a moment to control the screens on my end here. All right. That should work. And one moment to better fix the layout here so that I can start sharing my slides. All right, so we're shifting gear a little bit. We're moving from technical considerations to more research aspects, because as part of ORD, and particularly CSER, and you can see our map of ORD locations in the United States, CSER is headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio, and part of our mission is to conduct research and technical support. So the basics of lead corrosion and lead release that I'll be talking about today are really from the lens of research and technical support, rather than the regulatory considerations that we heard about earlier. So you've probably all seen photos like this before of lead sources, legacy ones around the United States. We may have full pure lead pipes, 100% leaded materials still in service, such as the full lead service line on the left photo. We may also have partial connections where the public portion of the lead service line has been replaced with copper pipe, like in the photo in the middle top. You can see the remainder section of the thicker lead pipe still in place on the private side, and a wiped leaded solder connecting the 2 dissimilar metals. This is kind of an older way to connect new copper with the remaining lead. And on the top right, sorry, you can actually see different kinds of brass connectors and even plastics that can be used for those. Lead goosenecks are shorter pipe sections, which are used to connect water mains to service lines. And at the bottom right, I also wanted to show you kind of a pure lead lined pipe. The pipe itself is actually an iron service line, but it has been lined with 100% lead lining. This is not common in all of the United States, but pipes like this used to be installed in some areas of the United States, like, for example, the Midwest. It is important to know where and what lead sources still exist. So materials inventory is certainly critical to understand all of these sources. And of course, aside from the pure lead pipes or pure lead linings, we may also have still legacy lead alloys around, such as leaded solder on the photo on the left here. you can see a very poorly made leaded solder joint kind of seeping on the outside of the copper pipe, but it actually seeped on the inside, came into contact with drinking water, and contaminated drinking water at the tap in this specific location of a lead poisoned child. The middle photo is showing you an older model of a leaded brass faucet, chrome plated. You can see the individual components of it, which do consist of leaded brass alloys ranging from less than 0.5% lead content to 2 and 3% lead content. Obviously, newer leaded models are not allowed to have more than 0.25% lead on the wetted surface, but a lot of our houses and apartments, certainly mine, are older than the new restrictions, and we do have a lot of these old legacy brasses around. Galvanized pipe is also a source of lead. Aside from the impurities on the galvanization layer, impurities of lead, perhaps its biggest contribution to lead is the fact that it sorbs lead from upstream sources and then becomes itself a source of lead and desorbs that lead back into the drinking water. Because these different diverse legacy leaded materials may undergo different corrosion reactions, interact with the water chemistry differently, and result in different levels of lead contamination, it is important to have an understanding of sorry, exactly which lead sources we have in our system. For the corrosion types that are of concern for lead, most folks usually have in mind uniform corrosion, which is typically what people think about being represented on the photo on the top left. This is pure lead pipe cut open. You can see the metallic shiny wall of the pipe, and inside you can see the scale layer that formed, which is beige, kind of off-white. So when we're talking about uniform corrosion, we're thinking about this process that is affecting the whole pipe, its whole length, in the same way. But uniform corrosion does not always mean uniform scale. So if you look at the top right photo, that's another lead pipe that was received by ORD's Advanced Materials and Solids Analysis Research Corps. It was again cut open. This is a close-up photo of the scale, and you can see with the arrows different layers of scale from L1 to L4. You can also see the pipe wall depicted there. So uniform corrosion definitely does not always mean uniform scale. We have, of course, other types of corrosion that are important for lead that are localized or else not uniform. One of those would be de-alloying. This would affect leaded brass alloys. For example, dezincification is the preferential dissolution of zinc from the brass, which may impact the other metals in the alloy as well, including lead. Galvanic corrosion is probably one that you've heard about. It exacerbates lead corrosion above and beyond what would normally occur for lead pipe alone if water chemistry triggers galvanic corrosion. And it happens when you have the coupling of lead with a dissimilar metal that's more noble. In the photo at the bottom right here, you can see a leaded solder, solder joint between lead and brass, where at the top right, where the lead piece of that connection is, you can see a big wall close to the connection of the lead with the brass. This is basically the lead pipe having really been sacrificed, corroded to the extent that we lost a lot of lead from the lead pipe wall into the water, contaminating the water. This is an issue in partial lead service line replacements, in solder joints, in leaded brass, and anytime we have dissimilar metals connected in our drinking water distribution systems. But let's stick with uniform corrosion for simplicity now. Corrosion itself is a process of two parallel reactions. The first one is oxidation. So the metallic lead pipe, it loses electrons to release lead ions into drinking water, either lead +2 ions or all the way to lead +4 ions if the oxidizing strength of the water is high enough. For this to happen, there needs to be a reduction reaction happening in parallel. Reduction is usually happening by a disinfectant in the water, some sort of oxidant, such as chlorine species, for example, if we add chlorine in the water for disinfection. and the oxidant consumes the electrons that were released by the lead metal when it was oxidized. There are two possible oxidation states for corroded lead, either lead +2 and lead +4, and those will become important in a minute. So if we look at the schematic here on the top, this is a cross-section of a lead pipe. You can see the lead pipe wall represented by gray at the bottom of the schematic, and then you can see the water with light blue on top. And you can see that corrosion process and the reactions that I showed you earlier sort of depicted on the pipe wall, and the leaching of lead +2 or lead +4 corroded lead ions into the water. This is the first part to metal release, but not the most important one. The most important part is actually scale formation, which is depicted at the bottom schematic, where those ions that were previously released through the process of corrosion react with other constituents in the water to form a scale. For example, if we have lead +2 ions leached out in an idealized scenario of scale solids, this would react with the carbonate system in the water to form either lead +2 carbonates or lead +2 hydroxycarbonates. If we were adding an orthophosphate corrosion inhibitor into the water, in the ideal scenario, we would be forming a lead +2 orthophosphate scale. In the case where we have really strong oxidizing conditions and lead +4 ions being leached into the water instead of lead +2, in this case we would have lead +4 corrosion solids forming like PbO2 represented here. So the solubility of the scale that forms is really critically important to metal release, because that's what really controls lead release. In my schematic at the bottom, you see those two arrows, the red arrows coming outward the scale and inward to the scale. This is kind of the equilibrium and the balance with the water that's flowing through, and that's really controlling lead release. You also see another arrow kind of disrupting the scale and releasing particles into the water. That has to do with the physical integrity of the scale, how well it is adhered to the pipe wall, and how easily it can be disrupted by hydraulic disturbances. We're not necessarily going to go into particular lead release in this presentation. It's a pretty complicated and hard to predict, almost semi-random phenomenon, but it's also important in total lead release as well. The minerals that were mentioned in the previous slide are kind of idealized situations. In practice, scale on the interior surface of lead pipes can be very complex, and these are photographs of lead pipes received at EPA's AMSARC and analyzed here. They're close-up photos of what pipe scales look in 9 samples that were analyzed, and you can see that there really is, at least visually, right, a variety of scale. They have different colors, they have different textures. In some cases, like in the top right pipe, you can see that part of the scale basically was dislodged from the pipe. So these are very complicated situations, not as simple as I made them sound in the previous slide. In some cases, we may even have other constituents on the scale, not just lead. Those could be anything from aluminum, manganese, iron, phosphorus, and calcium. And if we have coatings like that, which are thick, they may actually interfere with the orthophosphate chemical that we want to add for corrosion control. They may interfere with pH adjustment or other corrosion control treatment that we choose. So going back to that concept of corrosion and metal release, pure corrosion itself, so those reactions of oxidation reduction that are electrochemical and we have electrons flowing, those are important for pure fresh lead pipe at the very beginning, but they become less important when the surface of the pipe becomes covered with scale. So for legacy pipes being in service for decades or even a century or more, pure corrosion is not as important. What becomes important is that makeup of the scale that has formed, and specifically the lead solubility of that scale at the water contact. Also the physical properties of the scale, how easily it can be physically destabilized by hydraulic disturbances. Because the makeup of the scale is so different among drinking water distribution systems, lead solubility, therefore, is very different among systems. It can vary by orders of magnitude, and it's important to understand which waters are corrosive and which are not corrosive, and really try to control the corrosivity through appropriate corrosion control treatment, which needs to address both that early process of pure corrosion, but also metal release when we have the scale that has formed. There are many factors that affect corrosion and metal release, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but we will talk about some key ones. So we'll talk about pH and the carbonate system expressed by alkalinity or else dissolved inorganic carbon. We'll talk about the presence of oxidants in drinking water, primarily disinfectants, because those affect the oxidation reduction potential of the water or else its oxidizing power. We'll also talk about corrosion inhibitors and some particularly important ions like chloride and sulfate. Let's start with pH and oxidation reduction potential because they really control metal release. This is a simplified Pourbet diagram. You can see on the x-axis pH ranging from 0 all the way to 14. And on the y-axis, you can see that oxidation reduction potential of the water. In drinking water situations, we always have an ORP that's high enough to unfortunately not be in the immune area of the graph. That would be basically the lead pipe not corroding, just staying in place as a solid. But our second best bet is to create conditions that allow that passive to be in that passive area of the graph where we have just the right combination of pH and ORP to form these protective scales. Because if you look in this generic simplified Pourbet diagram, if we move to the left of that passive area or to the right, we're actually in the active corrosion region, which we want to avoid. So we want to have desirable pH and ORP combinations to allow for formation of those protective scales. This is an actual Pourbet diagram for lead. It is based on modeling, so it's an illustrative modeling prediction, assuming a certain level of dissolved inorganic carbon in this specific scenario. And you can see at the top right of the diagram this passive area of having formed PbO2 or else platinumite, which is a lead +4 solid. It's highly insoluble. So if we're able to form this in our water, we have a really protective situation. The majority of systems are not able to maintain high enough ORP and high pH to be in that area. But you can see kind of in the middle of the graph, there are also other solids that may form. So for example, in this specific scenario and modeling prediction, you can see this lead hydroxycarbonate that has formed in the middle, that really thin slice of solid where there's a broad range of ORP, but a kind of very limited pH area that allows for that to happen. That's also a passive protective scale. Please keep in mind that other assumptions would yield other aquatic complexes, the light blue areas in this graph, other solids, the beige areas in this graph, and other borders between those on the diagram. Those are depicted with the red lines. But this is just to illustrate how to read Pourbet diagrams and understand solid formation under lead +4 conditions or lead +2 controlling conditions. If we assume that we're in the middle of the ORP scale here, and we have lead +2 corrosion chemistry controlling, you notice that lead basically formed a solid with carbonate, and that makes the carbonate system really important in drinking water. We use DIC or else dissolved inorganic carbon to assess the carbonate system in waters. It's basically the sum of the different carbonate species, carbonate, bicarbonate, and carbonic acid. But we also measure our alkalinity as well, and this is the simplified equation for alkalinity in most drinking waters. Alkalinity also involves carbonic species, as you can see, but OHs and H+, which means there's a pH dependency as well. To understand corrosion, it is important to know what the DIC is or what the alkalinity is in our drinking water. And those two do have a linear relationship, but they're not the same thing. If we know the pH, we can, and know one of the two, we can basically calculate the other. The diagram on the left here basically showing that linear relationship between DIC and alkalinity. So let's look at DIC impacts, also pH impacts for this classic divalent lead +2 solubility, which is the case for most drinking water systems in the United States. This again is an illustrative solubility modeling diagram for an assumed range of dissolved inorganic carbon and pH. So you see here different curves representing a DIC of 5 milligrams per liter of carbon all the way to 100 milligrams per liter of carbon. And you can kind of see two general areas on the graph at low pHs. So toward the left area of the graph, we have one set of curves here where the higher the DIC, the lower the lead leaching. The y-axis here is lead solubility in milligrams per liter. So we really want to have the lowest possible lead here on the y-axis that we can for our conditions. But for lower pHs, on the graph, increasing the DIC drops lead, which is good. So we would like to have higher DICs at lower pH, but at higher pH, which is the kind of the right side of the graph here, increasing the DIC actually increases lead concentration. The difference between the two parts of the graph is the controlling solid that formed. On the left, we have cerussite, and as the pH goes up, that changes to hydrocerussite. So this is kind of a general theoretical understanding of the relationship between DIC and pH. It is based on theoretical solubility modeling. So it does assume a homogeneous scale with a single controlling solid, either cerussite, which is a lead carbonate. So again, the DIC is important because it gives the CO3 component to form that solid, or hydrocerussite, where again DIC is important, forming the lead hydroxycarbonate. But the impact of DIC is different depending on where you are on the graph. And you'll see that there is kind of a narrow pH range at the upper 7s or around 8, where actually the impact of DIC is not as important as it is in other areas of the graph. I talked about ORP earlier. ORP is really important, but we don't typically measure it in drinking water. It is the oxidation reduction potential of the water, and it's highly dependent on the disinfectant type and dose. These are measurements from an older experiment at the EPA, where you can see on the x-axis the oxidant dose in milligrams per liter added to the water versus the ORP measured on the y-axis. So at the bottom of the graph, you see data for just dissolved oxygen, no disinfectant added to the water. In the middle, you can see monochloramine, NH2Cl, and at the top with the red color and the green color, you can see chlorine species. So different oxidants really truly have different oxidizing power. For example, you can see here that ORP for chlorine is higher than monochloramine. But if we assume that we're here in the middle ORP range of this graph, so we're stuck with this divalent lead +2 solubility, let's go back to the solubility diagram and look at that again from a different lens. If we have a system with lead service lines, and we base our understanding on this theoretical solubility modeling calculations, we really would need a very high pH to minimize lead solubility. To be at the absolute lowest point in these curves, we would actually need to be forming hydrocerussite as the controlling solid, so therefore we would need fairly high pH, and we would need pretty low DIC as well. So the truly optimum range of pH and DIC are very limited, very narrow. There's certainly systems that can accomplish that, but not every system will be able to do that, which then brings us to corrosion inhibitors, chemicals that we add into the water to help control lead release. There's a lot of different kinds. Orthophosphate can be added either alone or as a zinc orthophosphate. You probably have heard of polyphosphates as well, added either alone or as blends with orthophosphate. and I have question marks there next to polyphosphates, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also have corrosion inhibitors that are not phosphate-based, such as sodium silicate. It is important to pick the right type of corrosion inhibitor, and even then, the appropriate dose will depend on the underlying water chemistry, the background pH, alkalinity, the reactive water quality constituents, so that the dose that we're using actually works. Let's go back to the question marks after poly. If we have orthophosphate added to the water, we expect the interaction of orthophosphate with the lead to be something like what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side of the slide. So when we have oxidized lead being leached into the water, the idea is that orthophosphate will precipitate that lead out of solution by forming some sort of lead phosphate solid to create a protective scale and therefore decrease lead solubility. When we have polyphosphates into the water, there's two things that can happen. The first one is partial reversion of the poly to ortho. So a small percent of the polyphosphate will convert from a polymer to monomers, and the orthophosphate that then forms will behave like the generic reaction on the left. But the majority of the polyphosphates will actually, the remaining ones that haven't converted, that haven't reverted, will actually react with the lead ions that were released to form aquatic lead complexes. So soluble species, not solids that precipitate out of solution to increase lead solubility. So these are very simple, generic reactions that I actually learned about when I was a master's student a very long time ago. The actual reactants and products may be different than what we're showing here, but this is the general expectation of why polyphosphates are not expected to work well for lead corrosion control. These generic reactions show the interaction of phosphate with lead, but phosphates may also react with other constituents in the water. So even for polyphosphates, they may react with, for example, aluminum, calcium, or iron to form some sort of film there. It could be amorphous. And they can also actually inhibit the growth of the good crystalline lead solids that we want, based on what I'm told from our researchers at the AMSARC lab. So overall, polyphosphates are sequestering agents and not corrosion inhibitors. So let's stick to ortho to control lead release. The effectiveness of orthophosphate really depends on the dose for the underlying DIC and pH of our water, and also for the cleanliness of the lead pipe that we actually have. This is, again, theoretical lead solubility kind of calculations depicted on the graph. On the x-axis, you can see the phosphate added in milligrams per liter from 0 to 5. And on the y-axis, you can see lead solubility in milligrams per liter of lead. So again, we really want to minimize lead solubility on the y-axis to be at the absolute lowest point of any of those curves. The different colors depict different pHs from 7 to 8.5. And you can kind of see two groups of curves. The top ones have to do with high DIC, dissolved inorganic carbon of 48 milligrams per liter, whereas the kind of bottom curves represent a low DIC condition of 4.8 milligrams of carbon per liter. If we focus at these lower curves first, the pH is not as important. For these, the curves are pretty close together, and the pH doesn't make as much of a difference as it does for the higher DIC condition. And for the higher DIC condition, the point of diminishing returns for orthophosphate is actually higher. That means we need to add more ortho in the water to start minimizing lead leaching based on this diagram. So in the United Kingdom, for instance, where orthophosphate is the primary strategy for lead corrosion control, and where waters do have high DIC, high alkalinity, it's not surprising that they do rely on high orthophosphate doses of ranging from 4 to 6 to be able to control lead release. In the United States, we do have systems with high DIC, such as in the Midwest, but we also have systems with low DIC as well, such as in New England, for example. But most public water systems with lead service lines do not have corrosion control that strictly speaking, minimizes lead release in the sense that we're absolutely at the lowest point of any of these curves because it's really hard to achieve. So our colleague at EPA Region 5, Miguel del Toro, coined this term of point of diminishing returns for orthophosphate, where basically he suggested adding orthophosphate up to a point where after which additions of orthophosphate would actually result in small improvements, in small reductions in lead release, and he suggested that that's the key to cost-effective lead release control. But do keep in mind that these background constituents that we mentioned before that can make up scales such as aluminum, hardness ions, iron manganese, and others may interfere with that orthophosphate concentration, and we may actually need more if there's thick pipe scale layer there instead of a fairly smooth, clean pipe. So the point of diminishing returns for orthophosphate will vary with the background water chemistry and with the makeup of the scale from system to system. Even if we are in a pretty good condition where we have passive scales forming, we really need to maintain the conditions that created those stable passive scales to begin with. So if we go back to the Burbet diagram and let's assume we're at the good passive state of having formed lead +4 oxide or else platinumite at the top right of the diagram, any change in drinking water quality that will make us shift to the left of that diagram or from top to bottom of that diagram will make us move from the beige area to the light blue area here. So it's really important to make sure that that doesn't happen. And of course, changes do happen in drinking water systems, and it is possible for those protected pipe scales to be destabilized. For example, in Washington, D.C., we had a case where change in disinfectant from chlorine to chloramine caused a drop in the oxidation reduction potential. So we had a vertical shift on the y-axis on this graph, whereas Newark, New Jersey was a situation where a drop in pH actually destabilized the previously formed lead +4 scale. So in order to make sure that we don't have lead leaching problems, we need to ensure that we have high free chlorine residual throughout our system and low chlorine demand in our system, that we can maintain that ORP basically high enough throughout areas of our distribution system where we have lead service lines. And of course, the pH must be maintained as well. Talking a little bit about...
So Simoni, this is Tom. We're running out of time a little bit. Could you speed up a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So talking about chloride, thanks, Tom. Talking about a little bit about chloride and sulfate, you may have heard this term, chloride to sulfate mass ratio. It's basically the fraction of chloride divided by sulfate. It's been empirically shown to be important. The higher the chloride to sulfate mass ratio, the higher the lead leaching. An example was Flint, where the table at the bottom showing is when water quality changed, the chloride to sulfate mass ratio moved from about 0.5 to about 2, which was one contributing factor to water quality problems and lead leaching there. The CSMR is an important ratio empirically in aggravating lead leaching, especially galvanic corrosion. So any water change that affects this ratio, any water treatment change, that's a coagulation change, for example, changing chemical, must be evaluated. But the absolute concentrations of chloride and sulfate individually are also important, particularly in the case of chloride, which is a very aggressive ion for lead, copper, iron, and metal corrosion in general. There's a lot of parameters that affect metal release, aside from the ones that I've had time for. So please keep in mind that corrosion control treatment is intertwined with all of these other things that affect water chemistry and the makeup of scales, such as manganese, iron, calcium, and others that I mentioned earlier. At the very end, I'd just like very briefly, and I'm moving really quickly through slides here, just to point out that there are some indices talked about in engineering textbooks. Sometimes those are called corrosion indices. I've listed some here. If you look at how they're defined and how they're calculated, they're really focusing on calcium carbonate scaling rather than corrosion or metal release. And based on the work done at the US EPA, calcium carbonate scaling is very rarely present in pipe scales, and when it is, it's not the controlling factor to lead release. So please use caution using those indices. They're important calculations, but they do become unreliable as corrosion indices. So with that, materials inventories are critical to understand where and what lead sources still exist. There are many types of scale in lead pipes. Remember, lead plus 4 solids are way less soluble and therefore more desirable for lead plus 2. Polyphosphates are not really corrosion inhibitors. And as I mentioned earlier, pipes analyzed at the EPA have very complex heterogeneous scale layers, rarely containing calcium carbonate, making those corrosion indices not true corrosion indices. And in the end, corrosion control treatment is intertwined with old treatments affecting water chemistry. Lots of people on the Caesar corrosion team, and some examples here at the very end, if you want to check them out later, of how to access our work through the links that I'm offering. With that, Tom, thank you so much for your patience, and handing it back to you.
Oh, thank you, Simoni. Thank you for the great talk. So we do have a third talk today, and then we will get to questions. So our third speaker, with just moving right along, is Darren Lytle. Darren Lytle began work at the EPA in 1991, and he's been primarily researching drinking water quality, working on distribution system corrosion control and water quality through treatment. And he holds a BS in engineering from Akron, MS from Cincinnati, and a Ph.D. from the University of Illinois. And with that, I'll hand it to Darren.
All right, thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay? And okay, let me get this straightened around.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, so I'm gonna have to start. I'm gonna roll as soon as I get this straightened out here. Swap presenter. How's that? Looking good? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna talk about copper. Just to give you a little bit of background on copper. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm going to give you some background on copper. I'm going to talk about soluble copper levels or uniform corrosion. I'm going to talk about chemistry of copper. I'm going to talk a little bit about pitting corrosion and some things to consider when you have a pitting problem, which is getting a lot of interest these days with me. I'm going to start out where I start all the talks, and that's talking about copper 1 versus copper 2 chemistry. So this is just a solubility diagram showing the solubility of copper 1 solids. So copper is in 2 oxidation forms in water, copper 1 and copper 2. The point here is, though, is that copper 1 solubility is quite low relative to copper 2 solubility, which is represented in the lines here as a function of pH at different dissolved inorganic carbon concentrations. And the point here is simply that when we're concerned about copper levels, we're concerned about copper 2 chemistry. And that's not to say copper 1 chemistry isn't important, because we always do find copper 1 minerals on copper pipes. And there are cases that we've been involved with historically, let's say low DO groundwaters that are not adding disinfectant, and then they switch to adding disinfection. So they shift the copper chemistry on the pipes from copper 1 to copper 2, and then they have a big problem. So we have certainly run across that, and it's something to be aware of, but generally we consider copper 2 chemistry as being most important. So when it comes to controlling copper levels, perhaps the most important thing you get from this, and this is something we talk about all the time, is that copper levels change with time. There's an aging effect. And so if we're looking at this diagram here, this is simply showing copper levels versus pH as a function of age. And so basically, when you get your pipe and you start out with fresh surfaces, you start out with the solubility somewhere on the light blue line here that is represented, we think, by either cupric hydroxide or georgite, which are 2 amorphous solids, either one of them. But the point being is that they're relatively soluble. So I've got copper plotted here against pH. And what happens is that with time, you start out with this new pipe, but with time, copper levels come down as the minerals on the surface, as the georgite or cupric hydroxide age with time. They recrystallize, there's surface area changes, they react with water chemistry to eventually form either tenorite, which is CuO, a black material, or malachite, which is the copper hydroxycarbonate mineral, depending on the pH. So as you can see, the solubility is quite a bit lower. So aging is really important. And this can take decades, 20 to 30 years or more for this aging process to take place. So that's really the key. So with that said, I mean, this really does happen. This is examples of some sampling that was done on Wright-Patton Air Force Base a number of years ago. And on the base, they have facilities of all different ages. And so we were working with a graduate student, Nadia Turek, had done some sampling across the different facilities. We looked at second draw samples. So by the time we took the second draw, we were into the copper plumbing for sure. And sure enough, what we saw is that the highest copper levels were in the buildings that were at the time the youngest buildings, and then the lowest copper levels were those copper levels associated with older facilities. So this is really important, and as I said, it really does happen. And why is this important from a practical standpoint? Well, again, when we think about the lead and copper rule, we're targeting we're targeting worst case lead sites. That would be locations that have lead service lines, and of course, those are going to be older facilities. So, to catch a high copper level associated with a lead service line site might be a bit tricky. It would have to be some sort of situation, perhaps, where there'd be a replumb or something like that. But generally, the two don't go together. Is kind of the point of this. Copper levels are actually, as it turns out, pretty easy to predict, and that's sort of the nice thing about copper relative to lead, in that because newer copper is going to give you the highest copper levels. It's pretty predictable, and you can actually do precipitation experiments even to see what copper levels might be in a particular water. But we're using precipitation experiments here to just simply precipitate copper in the presence of different pHs and different dissolved inorganic carbon concentrations. And the thing to take from this is that copper levels are very sensitive, and the experimental data is actually in dots, and then the model data is in the solid lines. But the point is that the dots, the experimental data match up with the models really nicely. And then again, this is the new copper situation, cupric hydroxide situation, our worst case. So it's good to model the worst case, and that's relevant as well. But they match up pretty nicely. So certainly it shows here this sensitivity of the pH, which I think most of us understand that higher copper levels are going to be associated with lower pHs. And of course, it points out too that this effect of the DIC, the dissolved inorganic carbon concentration, as you increase your DIC from 10 to 50 to 100, copper levels go up quite a bit. And this is really important as well. So from a practical standpoint, again, when it comes to problems, another way to look at this, we got plotted up here different pHs versus milligrams of copper per liter versus the DIC. And here's the action level, which, by the way, is a health-based action level. It's an MCLG of 1.3. And the point here is that, look, if you're at pH of greater than 7.5 and your DIC is less than 35 from this diagram, you're not going to have high copper levels associated with that new plumbing, the worst case situation. Same thing goes for the conditions where you have DIC of less than 5 and a pH greater than 7. But if you're in that situation where you're at, let's say, pH 7.5, but your DIC is 50 or 60 or 70, and that's something we see a lot in the Midwest, are these kinds of waters, you're going to have a bit of a problem. Copper levels could be high in the newer plumbing, in particular in the newer plumbing situation. So what do you do about that? Well, can you raise the pH? Well, that could be an issue because it might take a lot of base to raise the pH in a water that has a high DIC or high buffer intensity. Second of all, a lot of the waters that we deal with, at least around in the Midwest, also have a lot of calcium. So you're talking about also too some scaling issues that might come about by trying to increase the pH. So what do you do about this difficult, challenging high DIC water that affects copper levels? Well, orthophosphate's an option. And once again, as I said, the nice thing about copper is it's fairly well predictable. And so we can look at and do work showing that, if we take, for example, this particular control situation, a DIC of 10 in the green here, and add increasing concentrations of orthophosphate from 1, 2 to 3 milligrams per liter, and we find that we can drop or lower the copper concentrations at pretty much all pHs that we look at. Now, the theoretical line and where things sort of fall apart is that we don't really understand exactly what's precipitating. So theory doesn't predict this, and we continue to try to understand this and study it these days because we still don't fully understand, because the material that we generally precipitate is an amorphous-based material. But nonetheless, it truly is, it really is effective. How does this work and what's going on and how this applies to our aging model? Well, as we look at the aging model, going back to that, we start out with our fresh scale of georgite or cupric hydroxide. And as we add orthophosphate, we find an immediate benefit. And again, this immediate benefit here will illustrate by this particular, we're assuming that this particular solid forms, although again, it's generally amorphous and we really don't know what exactly the material is. But nonetheless, we do know, and very predictably so, that it has a much lower solubility than the cupric hydroxide. Now, the downside to this is that you will observe an immediate benefit, but the other thing is that you won't fully benefit that full aging process. So it sort of stops. So aging sort of stops by the addition of the orthophosphate. So what you see is an initial benefit, a potentially big benefit when it comes to getting down below the action level. However, ultimately in the long run, you might not see the benefit of fully achieving the stable, ideal cupric oxide or malachite scale that could form as the aging process goes on. Interestingly enough, too, there's this strange activity that goes on in the surface of the pipe. So these are just looking at a couple of cases here at pH 8 and pH 7 experiments that we ran. And when you add orthophosphate, it's really strange in that the pipe almost looks new when orthophosphate is present from the beginning, as compared to what happens when no orthophosphate present. And this case, this looks like a bluish green material, which would likely be the malachite material that we do expect to form through aging. And so again, the benefits realized early on, but the aging does not proceed as normal. And again, there's a lot we need to learn. We need to understand what exactly is going on here in the prevention of solids that are forming on the surface and what is forming and slowing down the copper levels and copper release. Putting it all together, when it comes to orthophosphate, through using a series of bench scale studies and precipitation experiments, we were actually able to put together a kind of a model, an empirical model that actually fits, as I said before, pretty nicely with what really happens, because it is fairly predictable. And so we put this together as a guide in one of our Journal of AWWA at the time, now Water Science journal articles we put together, just showing the effect of orthophosphate dose at different DICs and different pHs to get us to theoretically the action level of 1.3 based on the worst case newer copper plumbing situation. So you can just get a sense for how much orthophosphate you might have to add for your particular chemistry. Another set of experiments that we did with copper recirculating loops. So unlike lead, where you got to go out and you got to harvest old lead service lines, because the complexity of lead service lines, the multiple layers that Simoni talked about and all that play into lead release aren't so important with copper. In fact, you can start with new copper plumbing because it's still relevant. People are still putting in. It represents the worst case scenario. So you could use new pipes to study copper release and copper corrosion and look at strategies to reduce it. And you could simply, another approach is simply just doing the precipitation experiments that I said. Just add copper to your existing water chemistry, filter the particles out that form, look at the soluble fraction left, and that gives you a pretty good indicator of the worst case copper levels that you might see in a system. You could add to those jar tests, we'll call them, you could add orthophosphate, and you could precipitate copper and get a sense for what dose you need to be at of phosphate to get you below the action level of 1.3 as well. In these experiments, we recirculated recirculated water around copper loops, and I'm not going to go into too many details to save some time here, but this illustrates the aging effect. You're probably thinking, okay, well, I've got, I'm up to 200 days here, and you can see how copper levels for this particular condition at pH 8.2 in this DIC, got some sulfate and chloride in the water, and we got some free chlorine. But you can see the aging effect is pretty clear here, and then it drops down in any form that in this case, at this pH, probably malachite and or tenorite. But the aging happens faster. You're probably thinking, geez, Darren, you said decades. Well, this is a continuously recirculating system, so it's a different scenario, but nonetheless, the point of aging is illustrated here. But what I really wanted to get at was this, is for those of you who are interested in Legionella and in buildings and controlling Legionella in buildings, I got a pop up there. So anyways, from controlling Legionella in buildings, what this is just showing is that with and without orthophosphate, chlorine levels in these recirculating loops. So we always started out with about 2 milligrams per liter, and at the end of various recirculating times, you can see how much chlorine is left. And the point being is that without phosphate, we often don't have a chlorine residual. But when we add phosphate, even from the beginning of these experiments, there's always a chlorine residual. And this is really, really important. I always tell people, people are always saying, well, you add orthophosphate, you're feeding the bacteria, and you're gonna increase your biofilm. And I always say, but when you have good corrosion control, particularly in a building where copper plumbing is used and you're adding orthophosphate, this really helps you maintain the chlorine residual. So what's better, no chlorine residual or adding orthophosphate to reduce the corrosion or the interaction between the chlorine residual and the pipe? Because that's basically what you're doing here is you're interfering with the oxidation of the pipe wall, the metal portion of that, because the orthophosphate's there for good corrosion control. So really, really important point. This is another way of looking at it, just to show that even, you know, for pH 9 and for 7, it's still, this is the total amount of chlorine consumed over this experiment of 150 to 200 days with orthophosphate and without. So big benefit. And I just wanted to show you here stagnation profiles. You are most are probably aware that if you let your water sit, you can get different copper levels because copper diffuses away from the pipe surface into the bulk water. And so if you take a sample, let's say here at 6 hours, if you let that water sit for, let's say, 16 hours, copper levels are going to be quite a bit higher at the end of 16 hours and beyond. So just important, you know, when it comes to sampling and such, that stagnation time is important in copper release. Now I want to jump into pinhole leaks and pitting corrosion. To be honest with you, I wouldn't surprise me if more of you are interested to hear about this, because hands down, the most technical assistance questions I get and the most downloads of my publications historically are associated with copper pinhole leaks. Huge, huge problem. I think I probably get a call a week on copper pitting corrosion. And it's crazy. So I know it's an issue out there and it's an issue all over the place. And so let's talk a little bit about it. Why are we concerned about it? Well, you know, costly repairs, leaks behind walls, mold and mildew could result, liability issues. It's complicated, many opinions out there. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of passing the blame. It's crazy when I get involved with these situations, the kinds of stories I hear, right? It's just, it's unbelievable. So the other side note here is that copper pitting, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a situation where someone said, I've got a copper pitting problem, pinhole leak problem in my community, and there's high copper levels associated with it. They just don't go hand in hand. So anyway, you know, what can I tell you about it? Well, it's complicated, and look, when a community comes to me, or when homeowners or residents come to me, I sort of say, look, you got to take a look at this from a multiple approach standpoint. You got to look at, hey, what are the solids analysis, scale analysis? Can you learn anything from looking at the surface? What's the water chemistry? What are the field observations? Not just in the community that has a problem, but potentially neighboring communities that are using the same water source but don't have a problem, or parts of the community that don't have a problem. It's oftentimes it's the newer parts of the community that have the problem, and the older parts don't. There is an electrochemistry component here potentially, because it is an electrochemical process. Bench scale studies, pilot scale studies, I'll show you a little bit about that, and it all leads to hopefully some sort of solution or strategy to move forward and eliminate the problem. Reported causes of pitting, and I say in quotes causes because I hear this all the time. Cheap copper plumbing, imperfections in it, poor plumbing workmanship, particles, aluminum, iron, others, biofilm, disinfection type, grounding. Grounding is kind of a different thing altogether, and I'm not even so sure. I haven't been convinced that there's ever been something that could say, yes, it's a grounding problem. I don't even know. I'm not sure about that. Others. And I stress and highlight causes because I don't think they're causes. People say they're the cause of the problem. I think they are factors that are associated with the initiation. But I would argue, and I think most of you would agree with me, that every pipe in every community has these things. Every pipe, right? I mean, so the question really is, what drives it? And I think when you see widespread community issues, relatively widespread anyways, water quality's got to be an important driver. I mean, yeah, if there's one home in an entire community of 500,000 that has a pitting problem, there's something going on in a home. But when you have, hundreds, then it's a different issue. So when do I see problems? Well, look, over the years, and I mean, decades, I would say 80 to 90% of problems come about in the case of low DIC waters, that is 10 to 15 milligrams of carbon per liter, high pH 8.5 to 9, chloride concentrations greater than 10, maybe sulfate's important, hot and cold water could be either issue. But anyways, that's the magic water right there. I mean, and again, it kind of stray outside of those bounds a little bit, and sometimes it does, but those are the issues. And that's the water that I always say, boy, if you're changing your water source or changing your treatment, look out for that water. Be careful because by the way, this is a great water for keeping copper levels low, but pitting corrosion, you better just be aware that it could raise some issues. Other factors to consider, including age of plumbing, history of treatment, and other things like that, we need to think about as well. Just wanted to show you its nature of pinhole leaks. Interestingly enough, A lot of pinhole leaks kind of seal themselves from the outside. You get this coating on the pipe. It looks kind of nasty, but you don't see the drips anymore. When do I see that? Well, I see that when the pipes are exposed to the air. But when you get something like this, you know, when does that happen? Well, that often happens when the pipes are, let's say, are not exposed to the air. They're wrapped in insulation. Maybe they're under concrete slabs. Then you can run into these big issues that eventually spill out and become a big leak problem. What does the pit look like? Here's anatomy. This is, I had some help here. Dr. Min Tang and Megan Razel helped me put this together. It's a really nice illustration of what happens here. Basically, you have a pit cap that's usually a copper sulfate mineral of some sort. You have your anode, which is where the pit and local attack actually takes place. This will be the anode. Next to it is the cathode. For whatever reason, the anode and cathode don't move. They stay put. This could be where particles become important, because the particles could be the point where the anode starts, underneath it, perhaps. Water chemistry is different between the anode and cathode. I don't know. I mean, but that seems like a reasonable explanation. pH can drop quite a bit because as copper 1 is being produced in the pit itself through hydrolysis and formation of cuprous oxide, I should say, you release H+, so the pH gets quite low. And we know this for a fact. I mean, I measured the pH coming out of water coming out of a pit can be quite low. Electrons transferred across the copper out to the cathode, where it interacts with the oxygen or chlorine or other disinfectant, and as a result, pH can tend to go up at the cathode. But this is kind of the anatomy of the pit, and again, you know, structurally we see this. We look at a lot of them. These are just some. I'm going to zip through these, but these are some pretty cool pictures when we were doing a lot of this work, showing the the pit itself. This thin layer, I skimmed over the thin layer of cupric oxide, but there's usually a thin layer of cuprous oxide, I should say, that's above the pit. It's membrane, we call it, the pit cap in the green. And so all the structures there, as I just described, this is just looking at the cap itself, looking down on it. Oftentimes we see other stuff on top of it, other deposits, aluminum and zinc and other things on top of it. This is after you take the cap off, you've got this pit membrane of cuprous oxide, and it oftentimes has little holes in it. And then below that are the cuprite crystals, beautiful, perfectly formed crystals of cuprite. So ideal conditions for cuprous, I'm sorry, not cuprite, but cuprous oxide. That's right, cuprite, formed and so really nice crystals, well formed. I did want to point out this. I mentioned to you earlier. I sort of skimmed over it, but it's important to look at other communities. This is just illustration of I don't know. Let's point out the top two communities. These are in Butler County, Ohio. They had some issues a number of years ago. High pH, low DIC. There it is. Chloride concentrations are significant. But interestingly enough, Site 1 and Site 2 were also communities near the Butler County site, receiving water from the same aquifer, treating it in the same way. Very similar pH, inorganic carbon concentrations are very similar, chloride concentrations are similar, but had no history at all of pinhole leak problems. Why? Well, as it turns out, sites 1 and 2 actually use sodium hexamethylphosphates in their distribution system. That's important information to latch onto, because that just suggests that there's something going on, perhaps there with the polyphosphate. So important as you think about and doing an investigation, what's happening nearby. Like soluble copper levels in uniform corrosion, you can actually do some piloting as well. It's just a different thing. You're not really interested necessarily in copper levels because, as I said before, they're low. But what you're doing is you're spending time looking at the pipe surface itself instead. So you're looking for that pit cap to form. And so here we have some recirculating experiments. We've taken new copper pipe from the hardware store and just put it on a unistrut frame, and just simply had a utility run water through it and periodically pull. We had little union connections, pull them off, look up the pipe and look for the pit caps. And it worked amazingly well. I mean, it took several months for something to develop, but it's something that might work if you're in a desperate situation. We did these experiments, again, different TICs or DICs, different pHs, 6, 7, 8, and 9, different sulfate concentrations. But all I wanted to show you here with these experiments was that at pH 9 and the low DIC, what we found again are these little splotches of corrosion byproducts. And again, when we do our cross sections and we look at what's going on, we see below those caps, we'll call them, in the low DIC waters at high pH. Sure enough, we see the local attack. And so we see the cap with the sulfate, copper sulfate minerals, and chlorine is at the I should have mentioned this earlier, but chlorine chloride ion, it's always at the base of these things and always is actively accelerating and keeping the corrosion process moving along. Phosphate, strangely enough, what do you know? Phosphate, we don't see those pits form. We didn't see the pit caps form. We didn't see any signs of pitting corrosion in high DIC, in this case, low DIC waters at high pH. Like the uniform corrosion experiments, pipes look brand new. So there may be something to the benefit of adding orthophosphate in preventing them from pits from forming in the first place. But can you stop a situation that's already going, we'll say a long-term issue with pitting corrosion that's well established? So this is just some experiments that we did, not experiments, this is actually full-scale data that we received pipes from a community after 10 months of adding a blended phosphate. And what we found was that within the pit cap, so we stripped the pit cap off the pit itself, and within the pit cap, we saw rings of orthophosphate. So, what we observed is that the frequency of pinhole leaks slows down when orthophosphate is present in an existing situation, which is a good thing. They don't necessarily completely stop, but slowing down is a success sometimes in these situations. And somehow, in some way, the orthophosphate could be sort of sealing off the anode and/or cathode in the cell. So I think more needs to be done on that. And I always tell people, I said, I don't know, how long it will take to stop the existing problem, but it may slow it down. So some additional thoughts. History of the community is really important. Age of homes experiencing pinhole leaks in the community is really important. I get this all the time. We have this community, and there's only one part of the community that has a problem. Well, 9 times out of 10, it's the part of the community that was built most recently. The older part of the community had a history of different water quality changes over the years, and those pipe scales developed in a different way that made them protective, we'll say, to the current water chemistry, whereas the newer homes, not so much, right? They saw this new water, the problem water, from the get-go. Again, I mentioned this, check nearby communities, see what they got going on, hot versus cold. Look, a lot of times the problem is a hot problem only, or it's a cold water problem only. And so I get a piece of pipe from the cold water where there's a problem. I'm like, well, what about the hot water? I'd like to see that pipe too, because that may tell you something about why it's not a problem on the hot side. It may give you some information that could be helpful. Tracking the problem is always a challenge because no one wants to talk about this, right? The water utility, what are they going to do? I mean, it's they meet the action level by far a lot of times, right? So whose problem is it? And this is where the blame goes around, and and this and that. But you can speak to plumbers. Listen to the number of complaints that you might hear out there. Those kinds of things are important. Success is measured by the reported cases. So again, if you have 20 cases of reported pinhole leaks a month and it drops to 5 a month, that's success. So to wrap it up, and I know I really went through this fast, but I wanted to leave time for questions. Copper aging is important. Copper 2 solubility is greatly sensitive to DIC and pH. Orthophosphate reduces copper solubility, which could be very helpful, particularly in high DIC waters where pH adjustment may not be appropriate and challenging. Pitting corrosion is very complicated. I could talk about this all day. And the associated investigations have to consider multiple factors. Phosphate may be beneficial, and I'm going to kind of wrap it up here with this last diagram that Meg put together and Min put together. And look, don't quote me on these numbers by any means that I've got up here. But the point is that where you have high copper levels, upper left. Where you have high tendencies for pitting corrosion of copper, lower right. And they're opposite. They're opposite. So again, if I hear this a lot of times, oh, we're gonna take the pH up from 7.5 and we're gonna go to 9, and the DIC is 5. And I'm like, oh my gosh, your copper levels are gonna come down, but be aware that pitting corrosion could be an issue for you. And it doesn't show up right away either, right? It usually takes time. It takes 5-10 years before that pinhole actually breaks through, right? The pitting corrosion it takes time for it to get through the copper pipe wall. And with that, geez, I'm out of breath, but there's my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me. And I'm gonna turn it back over to Tom so we can get into some Q&A here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darren. Thanks for the great talk, and thanks to Simoni and Iliriana and Anne for fabulous presentations, and Lisa. And thank you for everybody who attended and sent in questions and participated in our webinar series. Thank you so much for attending, and don't miss the next one that's coming down the chain. So with that, this webinar has ended.